Welcome back to another Serial Killer Saturday. This time we traveled in New Orleans, a place known for its rich history and unique architecture, Mardi Gras, voodoo. Most everyone would agree it is a place of mystery that draws you to it. A melting pot of French, African, and American cultures. It is also well known for its hauntings, especially throughout the French Quarter. There are several ghost tours that will take you to many locations said to be haunted. One of those is the prior residence of Delphine LaLaurie. You might recognize the name by the portrayal of her in the third season of American Horror Story, Coven. Delphine is portrayed to do exactly what history has told us she has done to her slaves, in much more horrifically graphic detail than one might imagine for television. The great thing about the storyline, however, is the justice served by karma, and if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. Marie Delphine LaLaurie, more commonly known as Madame LaLaurie, was a Louisiana-born socialite and serial killer known for her involvement in the torture and murder of black slaves. One of 5 children, both of her parents were prominent members of the New Orleans white Creole community. Delphine's cousin, Augustine de McCarty, was mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. On June 11, 1800, Delphine married a high-ranking Spanish officer named Don Ramon. By 1804, Don Ramon had risen to the position of Consul General for Spain in Louisiana. Together they traveled to Spain. Accounts of the trip differ. Grace King wrote in 1921 that the trip was Don Ramon's military punishment, and that Delphine met the Queen, who was impressed by Delphine's beauty. Stanley Arthur's 1936 report differed. He stated that on March 26, 1804, Don Ramon was recalled to the court of Spain to take his place at court as befitting his new position, but that Don Ramon never arrived in Spain because he died in Havana on his way to Madrid. During the trip, Delphine had given birth to a child, and the two returned to New Orleans. In June 1808, Delphine married Jean Blanc, a prominent banker, merchant, lawyer, and legislator. Blanc purchased a house which became known later as the Villa Blanc. Delphine then had 4 more children by Blanc. Blanc died in 1816. Delphine then married her 3rd husband, physician Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie, who was much younger than she was, on June 25, 1825. In 1831, she bought property at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name with little involvement of her husband, and by 1832 had built a 3-story mansion there, complete with attached slave quarters. She lived there with her husband and 2 of her daughters and maintained a central position in the social circles of New Orleans. The LaLauries, in style of their social class at the time, maintained several black slaves in slave quarters attached to the Royal Street mansion. Accounts of Delphine LaLaurie's treatment of her slaves between 1831 and 1834 are mixed. Harriet Martineau wrote in 1838, recounting tales told to her by New Orleans residents during her 1836 visit, claiming LaLaurie's slaves were observed to be singularly haggard. However, in public appearances, LaLaurie was seen to be generally polite to black people and solicitous of her slaves' health. Court records of the time show that LaLaurie even emancipated 2 of her own slaves. Nevertheless, Martineau reported that public rumors about LaLaurie's mistreatment of her slaves were sufficiently widespread, so much so that a local lawyer was dispatched to remind LaLaurie of the laws relevant to the upkeep of slaves. During this visit, the lawyer found no evidence of wrongdoing or mistreatment of slaves by LaLaurie. Martineau also recounted other tales of LaLaurie's cruelty that were current among New Orleans residents in about 1836. She claimed that subsequent to the visit of the local lawyer, one of the LaLaurie's neighbors saw one of the LaLaurie's slaves, a 12-year-old girl named Leah, fall to her death from the roof of the Royal Street mansion while trying to avoid punishment from a whip-wielding Delphine. Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, causing Delphine to grab a whip and chase her. The body was subsequently buried on the mansion grounds. According to Martineau, this incident led to an investigation of the LaLauries, in which they were found guilty of illegal cruelty and forced to forfeit 9 slaves. These 9 slaves were then brought back to the LaLauries through the intermediary of one of their relatives, and returned to the Royal Street residences. Similarly, Martineau reported stories that LaLaurie kept her cook chained to the kitchen stove and beat her daughters when they attempted to feed the slaves. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in the LaLaurie residence on Royal Street, starting in the kitchen. When the police and fire marshals got there, they found a 70-year-old woman, the cook, chained to the stove by her ankle. She later confessed to them that she had set the fire as a suicide attempt for fear of her punishment, being taken to the uppermost room because she said anyone who had been taken there never came back. As reported in the New Orleans Bee of April 11, 1834, bystanders responding to the fire attempting to enter the slave quarters to ensure everyone had been evacuated. Upon being refused the keys by the LaLauries, the bystanders broke down the doors to the slave quarters and found 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, who claimed to have been imprisoned there for some months. One of those who entered the premises was a judge, who subsequently deposed to having found in the LaLaurie mansion, among others, a negress wearing an iron collar, an old Negro woman who had received a very deep wound in her head, who was too weak to be able to walk. The judge claimed that when he questioned Madame LaLaurie's husband about the slaves, he was told in an insolent manner that some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. A version of this story circulating in 1836, recounted by Martineau, added that the slaves were emaciated, showing signs of being flayed with a whip, were bound in restrictive postures, and wore spiked iron collars which kept their heads in static positions. When the discovery of the tortured slaves became widely known, a mob of local citizens attacked the LaLaurie residence and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. A sheriff and his officers were required to disperse the crowd. By the time the mob left, the Royal Street property had sustained major damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. The tortured slaves were then taken to a local jail, where they were available for public viewing. The New Orleans Bee reported that by April 12th, up to 4,000 people had attended to view the tortured slaves to convince themselves of their sufferings. Several weeks after the evacuation of the LaLaurie's slave quarters, 2 of the slaves found in the LaLaurie mansion had died since their rescue, and one paper was quoted as saying, "We understand that in digging in the yard, bodies have been disinterred, and the condemned well in the grounds of the mansion having been uncovered, others, particularly that of a child, were found." These claims were repeated by Martineau in her 1838 book, Retrospect of Western Travel, where she placed the number of unearthed bodies at 2, including the child. LaLaurie's life after the 1834 fire is not well documented. Martineau wrote in 1838 that LaLaurie fled New Orleans during the mob violence that followed the fire, taking a coach to the waterfront and traveling from there to Mobile, Alabama, and from there to Paris. Certainly, by the time Martineau personally visited the Royal Street mansion in 1836, it was still unoccupied and badly damaged, with gaping windows and empty walls. The circumstances of Delphine LaLaurie's death are also unclear. However, an old, cracked copper plate discovered in a cemetery indicated it was a headstone of LaLaurie. Folklore of LaLaurie's poor treatment of her slaves circulated in Louisiana during the 19th century and were reprinted in collections of stories by Henry Castellanos and George Washington Cable. After 1945, stories of the LaLaurie slaves became considerably more explicit, stating that LaLaurie had a sadistic appetite that never seemed to be appeased until she had inflicted on one or more of her black servitors some hideous form of torture, and claimed that those who responded to the 1834 fire had found male slaves, stark naked, chained to the wall, their eyes gouged out, their fingernails pulled off by the roots. Others had their joints skinned and festering. Great holes in their buttocks, where the flesh had been sliced away, their ears hanging by shreds, their lips sewn together, intestines pulled out and knotted around naked waists. There were holes in skulls where a rough stick had been inserted to stir the brains. All of these claims, however, are not supported by primary sources. The story was further popularized and embellished in Journey into Darkness, Ghosts and Vampires of New Orleans, 1998, by Kalila Katharina Smith, the operator of a New Orleans ghost tour business. Smith's book added several more explicit details to the discoveries allegedly made by rescuers during the 1834 fire, including a victim who obviously had her arms amputated and her skin peeled off in a circular pattern, making her look like a human caterpillar, and another who had her limbs broken and reset at odd angles so she resembled a human crab. Many of the new details in Smith's book were unsourced, while others were not supported by the sources given. Today, modern retellings of the LaLaurie myth often use Smith's versions of the tale to found claims of explicit tortures, and to place the number of slaves who died under LaLaurie's care at as many as 100. This home has been restored and is currently privately owned. The owners do not allow tours, nor do they ever plan to do so. In fact, if sitting outside on the second-floor balcony above the street and they see a tour group gather, they will grab their things and head inside. I am curious as to why you would ever buy it and then live in it. Of course, that might also leave many other historical homeowners to answer the same question. Slavery is a dark and horrible scar on the world, and how anyone has been delusional enough to believe that owning another living being to be totally normal is beyond me. And although the subject is painful, shameful, and uncomfortable, it is important to learn about our past, so we are not doomed to repeat it. If you have a serial killer you would like to see featured here, please contact me through any of my social media links, or leave me a comment here. See you next time.